December 14th, 2005, item number 112. Today's guest is Mark McCrery, CEO of Podtrac.
Podcast411.com. Listen different.
Welcome to the show. I'm your host, Rob, and this is the Podcast 411 podcast. On today's show, we're going to be talking to Mark, CEO of Podtrac. Before we get into that, as always, I want to remind you, if you have any feedback or comments you'd like to share with us anytime during the show where you're listening, call 206-666-HELP. That's 206-666-4357. Or if you're at your computer, you can send email and audio feedback to podcast411@gmail.com. Because this is a longer interview, we're going to go ahead and get right into the interview now. For those of you not familiar with Podtrac, Podtrac is a service that is there to offer a connection between podcasters and advertisers. This is not an infomercial. There is no quid pro quo, no payments, and I am in no way affiliated with Podtrac. But since a lot of the questions I do get in on the site have to do with how do you generate revenue from a podcast, I thought it'd be a really good idea to bring in Podtrac and talk to them. And they're going to be talking about their services and their terms and conditions in this interview. So here we go. Well, Mark, welcome to the show.
Well, thanks. Good to be here, Rob.
Mark, first question. What was your first computer?
The first computer that I owned, I think it was a IBM PC, and I think it was it wasn't actually mine, it was my father's that he brought home one day for, I guess it was around Christmas he brought it home, and it was the family PC. And so we used that a little bit.
On the podcasting side, do you remember what the first podcast was that you listened to?
Yeah, well, I think one of the first ones that I listened to was The Catholic Insider. It was ranked high on Podcast Alley, and so I would just normally dial into Podcast Alley's website or log into that website and then listen to the top 10 there. I remember Catholic Insider was one of those. The Don and Drew show, listened to that early on as well. Basically anything that made the top 10, and then just like anyone else, going through and sampling other podcasts and learning about new ones and testing them out.
Now, are there any that you're listening to on a regular basis today?
You know, I listen to a variety of podcasts. Well, first of all, whenever a podcast signs up with us at Podtrac, I try to go in and listen to them within the first few weeks, and so that when I'm talking to advertisers, then I can speak intelligently about the podcasts that have signed up with us at Podtrac. So I haven't listened to every single one that's registered with Podtrac, but I'm making my way through them on a regular basis. I listen to Distorted View. I listen to Nobody Likes Onions. Listen to Bitter's Pill. I've been watching Tiki Bar as of late. Check out Skepticality as well. And then MuggleCast is another one that I've been listening to recently. On the music side, I've been listening to IndieCast for quite a while, and also like to check out what the major networks are also putting out in terms of podcasts.
Okay, so quite a mix.
Yep.
Now, let's get into some questions about Podtrac, and we'll start out first. Just simply tell people, in your words, what Podtrac is and what you have to offer.
Yeah, so Podtrac is a way to connect advertisers and podcasters. And so we're kind of doing that through a few different ways. You know, our essential mission at Podtrac is to grow the podcast medium and to connect podcasters and advertisers, really give podcasters a revenue stream for their podcasts. When meeting with advertisers and advertising agencies, there are a few things that they need for to make a advertising decision with confidence in a podcast or really with any media. And they need to know who's listening to a podcast or who's listening to or watching a specific media. And they also need to know how many people are listening to a podcast, or in a broader sense, how many people are viewing or absorbing a specific medium. And so we're providing that data to advertisers and providing that data, we're gathering that data through the services that we're providing, and it's free to any podcast.
Based on your conversation with the advertisers, how receptive have they been to podcasting? Do they see it as a less a value add or more a value add than, say, radio advertising?
Well, it's interesting. In meeting with advertisers and advertising agencies, one of the things that they're interested in knowing is, they want to know more about podcasting. And podcasting is a new medium. It's new to all of us, essentially, especially new to advertising agencies in terms of having it on their radar screens. They're interested in finding out as much as they can about the medium. Comparing it to radio, one of the things that I've been talking to them about is that it's different than online radio in that the formats are shorter. It's not something that runs in the background like online radio today does, right? So if you go into an online radio website, you press play, you work on your Word document, your Excel document, your PowerPoint document, and the radio runs in the background, whether or not you're at your desk or whether or not you're actually listening to what's going on the station. And you can just tune in all day, and it plays all day, right? Now, with podcasting's different. The formats are shorter. There's more intentionality of listening.
It's more of a pull tech than a push tech, and people actually have to go out and find that individual show and click on it and hit play. And then when that one's over, they have to go and find the next one and click on it and hit play.
And yeah, so the content is more targeted, and it's more sought after, it's more desired, it's more specifically requested. That implies and communicates that the content is being listened to, that there is a stronger affinity for a specific program than there is for, say, a rock station from online radio that kind of runs perpetually all day.
Let's start with some of the services you offer. First one is the survey. And podcasters can add this survey, a link to it on their site. And one of the questions I've gotten back about the survey is, what's the minimum number of respondents before they get back, the podcaster will get back information on that survey?
One of the things that we did when we started the business was to team up with the largest global research firm to help us out, to make sure that we had the best minds working on the survey, and so that when I went into advertising agencies, that it would be a firm that they would recognize. So that firm is TNS. I've spoken with them, and our group has spoken with them about this question specifically. What they said is that they can get kind of a directional sort of read on, or we can all get a directional sort of read on the types of listeners in terms of their demographic makeup with as few as about 50 respondents to the survey. But the stats will be more true if we're able to get 200 or more.
Now, 99% of podcasters aren't going to be able to get 200 respondents, because you're probably at best going to be able to get 1 out of every 10, maybe 1 out of every 20 people to actually do something for you. I mean, you can only get about 1 out of every 20 people just to vote for you at Podcast Alley. And most podcasts, 90 plus percentage of podcasts have less than 200 subscribers, have less than 250 subscribers. After 50, are they going to be able to get the results, or are you going to wait until it's 200?
Okay, so yeah, we'll get back with the podcasters by the end of January with some read on their survey results.
Okay,
and the ones that we'll get back sooner than that will be the ones that have a significant number of respondents, and then we're assuming that in the meantime, then each podcaster is continuing to encourage their listeners to come to their website and fill out the survey, and then we'll get back with all the podcasters with some information by the end of January.
Ultimately, the goal here is to connect advertisers with podcasters and to get the advertisements into the podcasters' podcast.
That's right.
Is there any rules about where that advertisement has to be? Can they put that 3, 4, or 5 minutes into their show, or are they going to have to put it right at the beginning of the show?
Yeah, the format that we've been talking to both podcasters and advertisers about has a few different components to it. First is either an announcer-read format, which means that in this case, an individual podcaster would be reading a short message at the beginning of the podcast, and then a produced spot that would go at the very end of the podcast. So that's up to a 30-second produced spot by an advertiser or advertising agency. Now, if we talk about the first advertisement position at the beginning, when I say beginning, it's within the first 90 seconds of the podcast. So that gives the podcaster an opportunity to introduce the podcast, to have some sort of branded introduction, and then to talk about whatever they like to talk about before the advertisement comes in, or the host read message comes on, and then to get on with the main content for their podcast.
Okay, so, because I was curious if there was any flexibility, because I know a lot of people I've talked with are very concerned about having any advertisement in the first couple minutes of their shows, because podcasts they listen to now that have these forced commercials up front, they just get turned off. There's a certain percentage of people that listen to podcasts that are going to get turned off, and if they don't have a chance to make a first impression void of an ad, I know some people are concerned, if I have to have an ad in the first 2 minutes, they said, then I won't have an ad in my show.
Or in the podcasts that I've listened to, I've heard them at the very, very beginning of the podcast, which is kind of called a pre-roll. So before the podcast starts, and I don't think that that's ideal position for an advertisement, because I think when you press play, whether from iTunes or on a podcast directory website or your own website, that you expect to hear that podcast start, right? And then so you want to make sure that you're able to respond to listener expectations for hearing the podcast. And so I think the format that we've come up with is, it's a starting point, and who knows how this will evolve over the next 12 months. But the starting point is to enable the podcaster to have some time to introduce their podcast and to develop some sort of connection with the user, and then also to have the advertiser have a message up front. That's going to be positive for the podcaster as well, because what that's doing is it's in this period of time where we don't have a measure of plays versus downloads, that's going to give some confidence to the advertiser that if a podcast is downloaded and it's at least partially played, it's a likelihood that advertising exposure has been made. Some of this will be developed kind of in a customized way, working with different advertisers and different podcasters. So we also want to say at Podtrac that nothing is set in stone, and that we're willing to work with podcasters and advertisers if they have different opinions on ad formats. If there are some strong objections to having it within the first couple minutes, I'd like to understand that a little bit better from the individual podcasters and be interested in having a conversation about that.
That'll lead me into a question I was going to save, but I'll go to that one now. And that is, how do podcasters interact with Podtrac? I mean, who should they contact if they have questions and comments and concerns?
At Podtrac, we've got a team of folks that are working on bringing all the services to podcasters and advertisers. We have someone who's responsible for the survey. We have someone that is managing the measurement system, and we have folks that are working with advertisers, and then just a support team that works with podcasters. So I guess the best thing for them to do really is to email questions or comments into support@podtrac.com, and then we can route it to the right people.
And your website is at
www.podtrac.com.
And that's TRAC.
Yeah, TRAC.
Okay. Obviously the two questions that come up, and I've gotten from a lot of people about any service, really comes down to, what's the split? So let's assume that $100 comes in from advertisers to you at Podtrac. How many of those dollars get to the podcaster's hands, and how many does Podtrac keep to provide the service? And then the other would be, how long, once a podcaster commits to Podtrac, are they locked into using Podtrac for the service to add advertisements into their podcasts?
Great. Well, the plan is to give podcasters, for every $100 that comes in, to give them $75, and to give Podtrac $25 of that. And so our goal at Podtrac is, again, to grow the medium, to grow podcasting as a medium. And the best way to do that is to give podcasters the incentive to create great shows, create great content, and they need that financial incentive to do so. And so we want to grow with podcasters as they grow their audiences, and again, to give them the financial incentive to make that happen. In terms of the time commitment, what we're looking for are podcasters to sign up with us and for us to serve as their advertising partner. And so, but we're also not interested in owning content, and we're not interested in long-term commitments. We think podcasters have a right to sign up with Podtrac and to work with us in maximizing their value proposition to advertisers. But, we're not asking for podcasters to sign up with us for a long period of time. We think we're going to provide that value, but we're not going to have any sort of long time frame commitments in writing. So our terms and conditions are still with the lawyer. We're looking for a time commitment that's going to be more in the quarter by quarter basis. So more quarter by quarter than on an annual basis, if that makes sense.
So a short time commitment and a pretty equitable split. I have to ask this question because a lot of people that I talked to before this interview asked me this question, but I know it's not a fair question to ask. So, but if I don't ask it, people are going to ask why I didn't ask it. So I'm going to ask it, give my opinion, and then let you take over.
Okay.
And that is, the question is, well, how many dollars do you think you can get per 1,000 downloads? And I think that's a very speculative question based on the genre of the podcast and how niche-y that podcast is. I think if you have Eat Feed and you're focused on a food, that you're going to get a higher dollar per 1,000 downloads than if you're, say, a tech podcast. I think tech podcasts, no offense to tech podcasts because I'm one of them, but unfortunately I think we're going to be considered more a dime a dozen in the world of podcasting than, say, a very niche show, say like White Roof Radio, which talks about Mini Coopers. Mm-hmm. Now, your opinion.
Great question because, advertisers are wondering how much podcast advertising costs, and podcasters interested in how much they're going to get for their podcast, and so the questions are going back and forth among both groups. I can tell you what. So what that is saying is that there's no established market rate for podcast advertising yet. We think that Podtrac will help define that by virtue of the number of podcasters that have signed up with Podtrac and the variety of podcasts that are signing up with Podtrac and the variety of interest coming from advertisers and advertising agencies. When you look at the deals that have been done in the podcasting space up to this point, I've seen as low as $20 per 1,000. Actually, I've seen a lot lower than that. I've seen in the couple dollar range per 1,000 downloads, all the way up to $400 per 1,000 downloads. Now, on the upper range, let's talk about the upper and the lower ranges both. So on the upper range, with a $400 cost per 1,000 download deal, an advertiser didn't go to a podcast and say, look at your number of downloads and to say, I'm willing to pay a $400 CPM. What they did do is go to a blog site and said that they wanted to build a new podcast with this blog site, and then that they would pay $6,000 a month for podcasts to be developed. And when you look at the number of downloads over the 6 month, it was a 6 month deal. When you track that back into look at the actual number of downloads that were given out during that period, or that occurred during that period, it tracked back to a $400 CPM. Now, given that data, given that information from the get-go, would an advertiser be willing to spend $400 per 1,000? I suspect not, especially, again, in this early stage where the market's not yet established. So that's the upper range. On the lower range deals that I've seen, there are some advertisers that are looking at podcast advertising on a cost per sale basis or a cost per inquiry basis. And so they're looking at how many leads are generated for a specific podcast and measuring that and working that back into, how much am I willing to pay as an advertiser for this to be in this podcast. That's really taking the direct marketing angle with podcast advertising, which applies pressure to CPMs or to cost per 1,000 downloads. And it also very much depends on who the advertiser is and what their estimated cost per sale is for a specific product, brand, or service. That's one data point on the low end and one data point on the high end. It's someplace in the middle, obviously. It's someplace in the middle, obviously. It'll be interesting to figure to see what happens.
Who's actually going to be negotiating the rate? If a podcaster comes in and signs up to your service, who negotiates the rate for the advertisement in that podcast? Is it Podtrac, or is the podcaster involved in it?
Podtrac negotiates that on behalf of the podcaster, but there will be communication back and forth with the podcaster to make sure that the podcaster is comfortable with the rate that's being discussed. When it comes to the actual negotiation of the deal, that's part of it. It's here's the advertiser and here's the rate, and does that make sense to you, the podcaster? So
the podcaster does have a point at the end to say, you know what, I just don't want that specific advertiser, and then they can just nix the whole deal.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Yeah, because, let's say you have a tech podcast, and for some reason Dell comes in, but you've got an Apple tattoo on your left ankle. You may not want Dell on your show.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And each podcast is going to have their own preferences, their own likes or dislikes for certain types of advertisers. And so we want to work with both groups. Again, at Podtrac, we want to connect the advertisers to podcasters, and it's really connecting the right advertisers to the right podcasters.
Just from your perspective, now that you've been involved with podcasting and videocasting, because you're also offering the service for videocasting, where do you see podcast and videocasting going in the next year in general?
Yeah, the interest from advertisers and advertising agencies has been amazing. So I think we're going to have broad participation from advertisers in the next 12 months. First, let me say that 12 months is an eternity when it comes to podcasting, the podcasting market, and even the next few months are going to be, is a long period of time. So we'll see lots and lots and lots of changes over the next 12 months for sure. I think it's exciting to see over the next 12 months, I think it'll be interesting to see the usability of a lot of the podcasting websites improve, and the podcatcher software along with that. I think we'll see some interesting stats out there on numbers of people listening or viewing podcasts on their PCs versus on their players, on their portable devices. Yeah, I think over the next 12 months, it's really going to be moving podcasting from a podcast listening and viewing experience more into a mainstream absorption of content that's delivered through podcasting technology.
What is Podtrac going to be doing on their end to help promote podcasting outside of the podcasting world? To help, do you have any plans to try to help bring in listeners or promote some of the shows that you're going to wind up getting affiliated with you?
Well, thanks, Rob. So we'll have some upcoming announcements on ways that we're promoting podcasting and podcasters outside of the podcast listening community. And as soon as we're ready to announce those, I'll give you a call.
Okay. Well, that's good to know because I've said on many of my shows that podcasting growth is going to come from outside the podcasting world, and that's where podcasters out there, if you're listening, that's where you need to be concentrating your PR and guerrilla marketing.
Absolutely, and I can't emphasize enough the importance of really thinking of ways to involve listeners in your website, because I think that's really what generates referrals and just broadens your community, broadens enthusiasm for your community, and also makes it more likely that you'll come up on some search results for topics that you're not even aware of that people might be searching on. And so to have some of that on your website, on Podcaster's website, is a good thing. But in addition to that, your point of bringing in additional folks outside of the current podcast listening audience is an important thing. Bring them in through other methods.
Since you've talked with so many different advertisers and you've been getting feedback, what advice would you like to offer out to podcasters to help them make their shows more attractive to advertisers?
One piece of advice to podcasters is to really know what it is, to really identify the podcast and the different attributes of your podcast that you're producing. That involves, looking at who your targets are, understanding the types of people that are listening to your podcast, and we're able to provide a lot of that information from the survey. But then it's, creating a brand around your podcast and making sure that your brand is targeted to your audience and that it's unique to you. And then it's communicating that brand to your audience. So communicating it through the introduction of your podcast and then on your website. And so thinking of ways to developing a strong brand for your podcast, I think is going to be very important for podcasters.
Okay. Well, Mark, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Well, thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
Well, folks, that concludes our interview with Mark McCrery, CEO of Podtrac. Mark, thank you so much for coming on the show. If you're a podcaster that's thinking about putting advertisements on your podcast, you now have a good baseline to measure against some of the other services that are out there. I think Mark was very forthcoming, not hiding anything, telling you what their terms and conditions are, and I think that should be appreciated. The nice thing about Podtrac, from looking into it, what I saw was that you as a podcaster do not have to change the URL, and they don't take ownership of your show. And I like the fact that their commitment time was short. Now, again, I'm not going to have advertisements on my show, so I'm just going by what I'm looking at and comparing some of the other services for you, the podcasters. But ultimately, you need to make the decision on which service out there is right for you. Podtrac's out there now, and it's one for you to check out. Well, at the end of today's program, we're going to go ahead and play a promo from the G News Central podcast, which is a mental health podcast, so please stick around for that. As always, if you have any feedback, call 206-666-HELP or send an email with audio feedback to podcast411@gmail.com. And last week, I mentioned that Scott Fletcher was going to be releasing a new Podcheck review. Well, it's out now. It was released last night. So go ahead and check it out. Go over to podcheck.com. It's a good show and some good information in there that goes well with today's show. That's going to go ahead and do it for us today. I'm your host, Rob, from Podcast 411, reminding you to listen different.
Hey, this is Eric from G News Central Podcast, your source for the latest mental health stories pulled from the internet. If you're a mental health counselor or school counselor, then I've got the podcast just for you. Check out my new podcast at gnewscentral.libsyn.com. That's gnewscentral.libsyn.com.